Hi, guys. I wanted to read one of my favorite October stories to you. She Made a Monster: How Mary Shelley Created Frankenstein. Well, obviously, there's no reason it has to be an October story, but that's when I like to read it. This book is found in our biography section in the 921s because it is the true story of a real author, Mary Shelley, even though she was writing a fictional story. Here we go. She Made a Monster: How Mary Shelley Created Frankenstein by Lynn Fulton, illustrated by Felicitas Sala. Read with permission of Alfred Knopf Books. 200 years ago, on a wild, stormy night, in a beautiful house on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, a young woman named Mary sat at her dressing table. She and her friends were staying in the house for the season, visiting Lord Byron, the famous English poet. Mary could hear the others still talking downstairs while she brushed her hair by candlelight, thinking of stories. Stories she'd read, stories she'd heard, stories she wanted to tell. For Mary wanted to become a writer. Her dear friend Percy Shelley, who would soon be her husband, was a poet, and Mary herself came from a family of writers. All around her, she felt the power of words, and she hoped that someday she too would write something important, something that would hit the world like a bolt of lightning, splitting the night sky. But for now, she only wanted to write a ghost story. It had all begun when the friends had read aloud from a book of frightening tales, entertaining each other through the rainy days and nights. Lord Byron had declared, "We should each write a ghost story. In a week, we will see who has written the best one." The week would be up tomorrow. The men had already finished their stories, tales of bloodthirsty vampires and vengeful ghosts. Of course, Byron is sure the best one will be his, Mary thought now. He is an excellent poet after all, but so arrogant. Yet, try as she might, Mary had found no way to begin her story. The clock struck midnight. Mary put down her hairbrush and tiptoed into the hall. Over the howling wind, she could hear her friends talking about the latest scientific experiments, their favorite topic. Percy's voice thundered up the stairs. "Electricity," he was saying. "Galvani used it to make a dead frog kick its legs." Dashing back to her room, Mary felt a shiver creep over her. She remembered hearing as a young girl about an even more ghastly experiment. A scientist made a corpse move using electricity. Mary had shuddered as she listened, clinging to her father's leg. She had only been 6 years old. To erase that terrible image from her mind, Mary opened her locket and looked at the tiny portrait of her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. She died when Mary was a baby. As a girl, Mary learned the alphabet by tracing the letters on her mother's tombstone. When she was older, she read everything her mother had written, stirring words about democracy and the rights of women, words that sparked courage and inspiration in many, but anger and outrage in many others. "Women, the equals of men. What a monstrous thought," people had said about her mother's ideas. And for Mary Wollstonecraft, to write them was even more monstrous. Women were not supposed to have ideas of their own, let alone publish them. Remember, it was 200 years ago. Now Mary snapped her locket shut. She wanted to prove that her mother was right. A woman's writing could be just as important as a man's. Downstairs, the men's voices grew louder and more excited. To give life to lifeless matter will be the ultimate triumph. Man will conquer nature and make her give up the secret. Mary shook her head as she listened. Nature might have a very good reason for keeping her secrets, she thought. Besides, what would happen to lifeless matter once someone had given it life? The men did not seem to care. They only asked if something could be done, never if it should. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the rain beat harder against the window. Mary watched the wax drip down her candle. Now she could hear the others saying goodnight and stepping softly up the stairs. She thought of ghosts and vampires. She thought of monsters. She thought of loneliness. The night was passing, and she still didn't have a story. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and Mary jumped as her reflection peered back at her from the mirror, pale and strange, like something dead restored to life. Wouldn't it be terrifying to see such a creature, she mused, or perhaps more terrifying, to be such a creature? Mary got into bed and stared up into the darkness. The house by the lake was still. The wind shrieked over the eaves, but only Mary was awake to hear it. She let the booming thunder fill her head. She closed her eyes to the bursts of lightning, but she did not sleep. Instead, as if in a dream, she saw a huge form lying on a table. It was a man, yet not a man. It had a hideous, scarred face. She saw a young student anxiously bending over the form with a candle. He had achieved his ambition. He had discovered nature's secret and given life to the creature on the table. But now he was afraid. He did not know what to do. He dropped the candle, covered his face with his hands, and ran away, hoping the ember of life he had sparked would die out. And suddenly, lying in her bed with the curtains shut, Mary felt as if she was the young creator. She felt as if she'd run to her room to cower under the sheets, trying not to think of the terrible thing she'd created, trying not to think of it coming to find her. She trembled as she imagined a hand, huge, gray, and twisted, appearing through the bed curtains. She saw the curtains part. The creature stared down at her with bulging yellow eyes. What did it want from her? Mary gasped and sat up in bed. She ripped open the curtains and recognized her own room in the moonlight. All was familiar and ordinary. There was no monster. There was only her imagination. Her heart pounded, but she was happy. She had found her story. Now, there's an author's note that I like to read because it gives us a little more detail. Author's note: Mary Shelley was 20 years old when Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, as it was first called, was published in 1818. At first, only 500 copies were printed, but soon all of England was talking about the dreadful tale of a man who built a monster from dead bodies. And to think, it was written by a young woman. Ladies were scandalized and gentlemen were scornful, but everyone was reading it. As early as 1823, the novel was adapted for stage. Lo and behold, I found myself famous, Mary wrote after seeing a performance. The first film of Frankenstein was produced in 1910, and since then, dozens more film, stage, radio, and TV adaptations of the book have been made. In her introduction to the 1831 edition of Frankenstein, Mary tells how the chilling tale of Victor Frankenstein and his monster was born. Her account of the summer of 1816 on Lake Geneva includes the stormy weather, Lord Byron's ghost story challenge, and her waking dream of the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. Mary doesn't mention Mary Wollstonecraft in the 1831 introduction, but it seemed important to include her famous mother in her thoughts. In the thoughts I imagine Mary might have had as Frankenstein was forming in her subconscious. I also added a deadline to the ghost story challenge, making it more like a contest. And finally, I put the entire group of friends under one roof at Byron's Villa Diodati. Actually, Mary, Percy, and Mary's stepsister were staying at a smaller villa nearby. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is not the same story as most people know from the movies. Unlike the square-headed Hollywood monster with bolts in its neck, the creature in Mary's book can speak and even read. He is lonely and longs to be part of a family. But because of his frightening appearance, he is hated and rejected by everyone, even his creator. When we envision Frankenstein's creature as only the inarticulate raging monster of stage and screen, we lose sight of Mary's message that hatred and prejudice can turn something innocent into something murderous. Even though it began in response to a ghost story challenge, Frankenstein is, of course, not exactly a ghost story. For just like Victor Frankenstein, Mary Shelley was creating something new, the kind of story that today we call science fiction. Whenever you read a book or see a movie about a scientist who goes too far, inventing something that becomes dangerous and uncontrollable, remember, it all began with Frankenstein. The monster Mary made lives on in our imaginations, just as vividly as he came into hers that stormy night over 200 years ago. I hope you guys enjoyed that story.